Okay, good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you're located across this globe. Hope you're all well today. My name is Paul DeMorgan and I'm with Resolve, and I want to welcome you to the third in a series of webinars that Resolve and Pew Charitable Trusts have been putting on over the past, I guess we started last maybe July, so 9 months or so, related to the draft seabed mining regulations. It's nice to see so many folks here. We've got about 50 or so far, and we're expecting a few more. We had about 130, I think, register. So thank you all for joining us. This particular webinar is related to and an opportunity to hear from some experts on a variety of different subjects, but to hear specifically on their thoughts about environmental decision-making models in other sectors and regimes, for that matter, that might be applicable to the governance of mining on the deep seabed. And so let me bring up the agenda itself here. Whoop, that's not it. And I'll just do a quick review before I say a couple of other words about the tool we're using and turn it over to Andrew Friedman from Pew to say a few opening remarks. So this particular agenda on the screen, and I believe we shared this with you as well before, is in Eastern Daylight Time, the time that we'll go through, but obviously you can make the adjustments to your own time. It's an hour-and-a-half webinar. I've already gone over the objective. In just a minute, as I said, I'll turn to Andrew for some opening comments, but then we'll get the opportunity to hear directly from three folks, and I'll introduce them all at a little bit later, obviously, but Angelique Pouponneau, Dr. Neil Craik, and Dr. Mark Squillace. And each of them will have about a 10 or so minute presentation. For those of you that are familiar with how we run these webinars, we'll then turn to a discussion amongst those three, addressing these four questions that you see under the panel discussion item. And then finally, we'll have a 20-minute or so opportunity for the panelists to respond to questions drawn from you, the participants. I'll explain how to do that in just one moment. Andrew and I will make a few closing remarks, and then we will adjourn at approximately 11:30 Eastern Daylight Time, an hour and a half from now. So we will be recording this webinar and posting it up on our website, and we'll also be developing a summary that we'll share with all of you subsequently. Okay, just a couple of quick things about the tool we're using. We're using Zoom Webinar, and it's got some good aspects and a few quirks, and so let me just explain those very briefly. You're going to be seeing the presenters. You'll see me, you'll see Andrew throughout different times, but we've just to help stay on track, we've set this up in listen-only mode. The primary way for you all to engage is through the Q&A tool. So you should have a menu or a menu bar, if you will, with a Q&A, and it will allow you to put questions in there. And we'll be collating those in preparation for that session a little bit later, and trying to pull key questions together, package them together for the presenters to speak to. We'll try and get to all the questions we can. So we haven't always been able to do that, but appreciate the insights and the thoughts in advance. If you're having any technical questions or concerns, you're welcome to send a note in the Q&A tool or an email to Maya Breitberg-Smith or Laura Bartok, my colleagues at Resolve. And you should have their emails from receiving the agenda earlier. We might send a note through the chat box. You'll see a little number pop up, but it's probably unlikely at this point. At this point, we have, I'm trying to see, about 70 participants. So thanks to everybody. We've had a broad cross-section of representatives, like with all of our webinars. I don't believe, unfortunately, that the Zoom webinar enables you to see that whole list. But we do put a list of names and affiliations in the summary, so you'll have a specific sense of, or not sense, a specific list of folks who also participated in this webinar. And I think that does it for me. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew at this point. And so Andrew, if you want to turn on your video, we'll get started.
Thanks so much, Paul. And thanks to all of you who are joining us from various time zones. Some colleagues who have joined me on video calls over the last year have seen the low ceilings or the ductwork behind me, as well as my clumsy attempts to hide them, and asked if I'm in a submarine. If only I were lucky enough to be doing some deep ocean exploration right now. Instead, I'm coming to you from a desk in my attic where I've found a quiet place to work. As this pandemic pushes into its second year, on the one hand, to some extent, we're all getting used to this, working from our homes, convening virtually. On the other hand, it's never far from our minds what a difficult year this has been for all of us, and how much we miss seeing you all in person, both professionally as a chance to connect and share knowledge, but also personally, for the chance to make and renew friendships. So we continue these webinars with our friends at Resolve to provide some sort of bridge to the days in the hopefully not too distant future where we can all see each other in person again. But they're also a reminder that even while we eagerly anticipate those reunions, questions about the future governance of seabed mining continue to come to the fore. Indeed, the topic of this particular session may be even more pressing than usual. Just last week, the International Seabed Authority released several draft documents containing standards and guidelines that touch on core aspects of environmental decision-making, including environmental impact assessments and statements, environmental management monitoring plans, the establishment of baseline data, and hazard identification and risk assessment, among others. These documents were developed by the ISA's Legal and Technical Commission, but have been open for stakeholder consultation over the next 2 months. The hope is that many of you participating in today's webinar will be making comments to strengthen those drafts. Much of today's content may have direct bearing on the ways we want to shape the very aspects of the ISA's decision-making now under consultation. So there's no better time for all of us to be considering what lessons we might learn from environmental decision-making under other regimes. We're delighted that today's panelists could share their time and their expertise with us. And so without further delay, I want to put you in their hands. But thank you all for sticking with us during this time and for taking this opportunity to further our collective knowledge. We at Pew are privileged to support it. Back to you, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Appreciate that. Then those thoughts, sentiments, and echo a lot of those, obviously, about getting together at some point here in the future. So we are right on schedule to turn to the perspectives on environmental decision making that we're very pleased to have 3 experts speaking about. They're going to talk about important elements of environmental decision-making and models from other sectors, as I mentioned. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, we're not going to be addressing questions real time, but go ahead and put them in the Q&A pod along the way, and we'll try and get as many of those answered as possible during the discussions. So first up is Angelique Pouponneau, and Angelique, I'll ask you to turn on your video. If you can now.
Yes, I can do.
Okay, great, fantastic. Angelique's the CEO of the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust. She's a lawyer, both in the Seychelles and the UK, and holds an LLM in environmental law, specializing in the law of the sea and natural resources law. She's a trained climate change negotiator under the AOSIS Climate Change Fellowship Program at the United Nations, and served as a legal expert of the African group of 6th Committee in Works of Oceans and Law of the Sea at the United Nations. So we're very pleased to have her with us, and I will turn it over to you to say hello and go ahead and share your screen whenever is appropriate.
Thank you very much, Paul, and greetings from the Seychelles, everyone. It's evening here. So we are kicking off today's discussion about environmental decision-making with regards to deep seabed mining, and looking to understand who are the relevant stakeholders in decision-making. Coming from the Seychelles and currently working at national level, I will weave the national experience we've had in the Seychelles and showcase how it relates, could be adaptable to the international process with regards to deep seabed mining. So I'm just going to share my screen at this point, as we are keen today to explore who are indeed the stakeholders of this process, as well as how to most proactively engage impacted communities and stakeholders. So this International Seabed Authority has a huge responsibility with governance of the area, with benefits accruing to the common heritage of mankind. And in defining who are the relevant stakeholders, to my mind, it is quite simple. If we think of humankind, I should say, yes, it is the general public. And public participation is nothing new to international agreements. We know that the right to information, participation, remedy are internationally protected human rights. And in fact, we go on as the international community to endorse this when we set up the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030 with SDG 16. And this is mostly in relation to justice and strong institutions, which includes targets to ensure public access to information and to develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions, and ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. These rights are seen in many multilateral agreements and indeed several declarations. But I want to think about how we're actually translating this into reality. Just a thought here when we think about the International Seabed Authority and the processes along that it leads, thinking about that it does not only represent common, and it says this in the term, common heritage of mankind, it not only represents today's generation, but also future generation. I've had the experience, or the good fortune, I should say, of participating in one of the meetings, and youth are evidently absent from these negotiations or these meetings, but perhaps we should consider going even further and making sure that we have someone representing the interests of future generations within these processes. There are even other important emerging norms of international law which recognizes the rights of other non-state actors, including indigenous peoples, as important contributors to international legal processes, and the need for special measures to ensure that marginalized people and marginalized groups are included. I want to share a little about our experience in the Seychelles in the process in the marine spatial planning process. This was considered to be one of the most inclusive and consultative process where all sectors were represented, and also small-scale fishers were actively participated, even though it meant moving away from workshop settings and providing avenues to ensure that people are given settings that they are most comfortable with. But that said, transparency is very important. And as such, the minutes of meetings that have been held under the marine spatial planning process have all been documented and placed on the website for anyone to see. Not only is this about participation and transparency, but the two give us something important, that is trust in the process. And in order to have trust in the process, these elements must be present, but it then leads to even more, being able to have buy-in from the various stakeholders effectively participate, not only just participate, but effectively participate in a mechanism that works for all its stakeholders. Of course, the process of marine spatial planning did attract a large crowd. Besides, we were talking about allowing some activities in some places and disallowing activities in others. And people were very clear as to how this process would in fact affect them, their livelihoods, their work and their lives and so on. But what has become abundantly clear, and this is, Seychelles is no exception, when it comes to the International Seabed Authority and deep seabed mining, there is a lack of understanding, in particular by coastal communities, of how these decisions, regulations that are being developed, and meetings are in fact going to affect them. So we need to move away from simply intending to be inclusive and make it a reality. But we need to be fair here. Let us give credit where credit is due. The International Seabed Authority has allowed accredited observer organization to attend annual sessions and make interventions, and for the last couple of years, and for member states to be able to hear, relate, perhaps adjust their views. Further, there has been annual council and assembly meetings that have been live streamed. Again, the use of technology to help with inclusion. And the ISA website is updated and includes information pertaining to intersessional workshops as well. So these are in fact strengths. I know there have been challenges when it comes to the COVID years, where the ISA has moved to virtual meetings as well as silence procedures, which may have led to less inclusion or even non-participation by non-state actors. But now let's turn to the weakness. And again, here a real problem is the fact that unfortunately, most citizens of states are hardly aware of the existence of the International Seabed Authority and the work that they do and the potential impact it may have on their waters and livelihoods, let alone for these governments to have consulted their citizens in developing the positions that they go to participate in these meetings with. Already at the International Seabed Authority at the ISA, there is limited engagement even by state parties. We have seen that there is very low state engagement where issues of quorum arise. Even states that would be negatively, adversely affected economically have not even been participating in the last few years with the ISA sessions as well. A couple are not even signatories to UNCLOS. Again, thinking about these are real issues that we are dealing with and yet to have a solution or a clear pathway, I should say. The issue of participation is probably set to get even worse, and especially with governments trying to cut costs from participating in international meetings. Further to that, there are no observer organizations representing indigenous communities, young people, or women. One study rated that the ISA's standing in public participation in decision-making as significantly lower than other relevant comparators. And we do have a question later on how it compares to other processes and other international frameworks. And I will share at that point my experience with the UNFCCC in comparison with that of the ISA. But I want to take a moment to share an anecdote and personal story. As a young woman from the Seychelles, I got involved with the matters of the ISA through an African group workshop. I attended purely for academic reasons at the time and became very interested in legal liability, issues of transboundary harm, and capacity building for developing countries. But I need to acknowledge my privilege. I was in New York at the UN, and I was able to get the right advice from various people to explain to me how to engage within the ISA framework, that I was able to make submissions, that I was able to engage. But that was a opportunity and a privilege, and one that not many people know about. But without this engagement of different minds, new ideas, it is possible that we are not tapping into the full potential and possible contributions that others have to bring. If you ask someone today how they could influence the International Seabed Authority meetings, I am sure we would get a real mixed bag of answers. Further to that, another personal experience, again from a national level, but just to make the point that these steps, these concrete actions have to be taken. As it relates to joining a trust in the Seychelles and making inclusion and accessibility a driving motto for 2 years. We had documents translated into local languages, we had targeted communication approaches, and capacity building for more people to know about our work. Not to say that all of this should fall onto the shoulders of the ISA, of course, but in collaboration with states and many non-governmental organizations, there is far more space, a lot more space for people to create awareness about ISA and their work, and as a result, get more people involved in the process. I'm very conscious of time, but my last point is just to move to the post-permit approval management and thinking about issues of oversight, enforcement, inspection, and the needs of challenges. And I'll end on this point that despite the ISA having limitations of financing and capacity, it cannot be an excuse for its inability to serve the functions of a regulator and to move away from being just a meeting convener. So perhaps our focus should not be just on the limitations of today's ISA, but focus on what ISA should transition to. We should be thinking about how the ISA becomes fit for purpose before it transitions. We must look to ensure that there are regulatory rules and institutional capacity. And so far with the regulations, we have done some work. But when it comes to institutional capacity, I think there is more work to be done. It would require experienced regulators, scientific expertise, environmental compliance assurance teams, and a clear strategy to ensure evidence-based decision-making. A true call for a clear roadmap for how we transition to the ISA to become an institution with the capacities to manage activities in the area as UNCLOS intended. Very conscious of time, I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Angelique. We'll look forward to the interactions between you and the other panelists and responses to further questions. But for now, to keep us moving along, I'm going to introduce our second presenter. That is Dr. Neil Craik. Neil is, and I'll ask you to turn on your camera there, Neil. Great, thank you. Neil is a professor of law at the University of Waterloo with appointments to I'm not sure I'll get it correct here. You can clarify, Neil, but Balsillie School of International Affairs and the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development, where he teaches and research in the fields of international and Canadian environmental law. His current research examines the legal structure of global commons regimes, and he has particular interest in climate and geoengineering law and governance, deep seabed mining regulation, and environmental impact assessment. I'm sure many of you know Neil and are aware of his work, and we're very pleased to have him with us today. So I'll turn it over to you, Neil. Thank you again.
Thanks very much, Paul, and just let me get my screen going here. Sorry, Paul, can you just confirm what are you seeing?
Yeah, we're seeing the slide.
Like just the proper slide, not my presentation notes?
Yeah.
Okay, terrific. Okay, we're off to the races then. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us here today. And I want to extend my thanks to Andrew's team at Pew and Paul's team at Resolve for putting this on. Today, I'm going to talk about a study that I did with a colleague of mine where we looked at a number of different EIA processes and compared those to the processes of the ISA in relation to deep seabed mining. And so here we looked at 11 different EIA processes, some of them international, some from developed countries, some from developing countries, mostly ISA members, but we also included the United States because of the prominent role of its EIA system in the development of EIA around the world. This wasn't really a best practices study. Really what animated our thinking around this study was that you have to match the EIA process to the unique institutional elements where the decision is being made. And so what we were really interested in was what we called fitness. And, so to actually look at the kinds of practices that seem to fit the elements that are important in deep seabed mining. And so if we just look at those elements for a second, and many of you will be familiar with this. And so in terms of the knowledge context, one of the things we absolutely know is that there's a great amount of uncertainty with respect to the knowledge of deep ocean ecosystems, and it's very much a dynamic knowledge environment. We continue to know more, we continue to find out greater things about the degree of connectivity, about the degree of high levels of biodiversity in deep ocean ecosystems. There's also a great deal of informational asymmetry in the sense that much of the scientific work is actually being done by mining proponents. They're the ones who have the ability and capital to actually do this research. And so from a regulatory standpoint, we have a situation where the proponents have or may have much more information about the environment than the regulator itself. The normative context is again quite different from domestic regulatory situations. We don't have the kind of dense amount of regulation. So if I compare it to Canada, where terrestrial mining would be governed by specific water laws and biodiversity laws and air pollution laws, that kind of regulatory density is just missing here in terms of precise standards. Certainly that's being built out by the ISA through the draft regulations, but it's very much a work in process. So much of the sort of normative provisions tend to be more abstracted and at the sort of level of principle or guidelines. But there are some important ones, including the due diligence obligations, which of course environmental impact assessment is a key part in both the ISA and sponsoring states' obligation to prevent serious and significant environmental harm. And finally, turning to the institutional context, I think there's a number of important things to point out. One is the nature of the approval itself, which relates to the very long-term leases that arise from the approvals. And because those leases have security of tenure, the limited degree to which the ISA can change lease conditions or cancel leases, they're really protected in some quite profound ways under the convention. And so that provides an additional constraint. The other element that again, people will be familiar with is the internal capacity issues of the ISA itself. And again, if we compare that to a domestic regulator, the Canadian Fisheries and Oceans Ministry has hundreds and hundreds of scientists with PhDs, running models, understanding the situation. And the ISA again is quite different in terms of its internal capacity of the Secretariat and the way in which the Legal and Technical Commission meets on a sort of time-by-time basis. And so this really takes us to, I think, questions around what we want environmental impact assessment to do. And here I would make 2 points. One, we have to think of EIA not as a report or a study, but as a process of decision making, that it's much more than just simply a scientific process. It's a political process. It's a normative process. And really what we're trying to achieve here, I think, is what I would call legitimacy enhancing decision making. These are new decisions, and crucially important aspect of the decision is ensuring that the decisions made are being seen as legitimate by the ISA members, but also, as Angelique pointed out, by the much broader constituencies that are engaged by these issues. This requires that the decisions must be scientifically robust and evidence-based, that politically they must be inclusive and open, and normatively must be seen to align with underlying normative goals. And this requires that the process has to be both justificatory, in other words, that the decision makers have to sort of provide reasons so people can understand how these decisions are made, with particular attention to accountability. So let me talk about this in relation to a couple of points that we looked at, and just ignore this really sort of dense looking table here if you want to go back and look at it. So let me just talk a little bit about the scoping process. And so scoping in EIA is really the creation of the terms of reference for a study, and it's crucially important because it defines the scope of the project, it defines the study boundaries, the spatial boundaries, the temporal boundaries, the very complex methodologies used, which in the case of a lot of deep ocean ecology really are model driven, and also defines the form of mitigation. And so right now what we see is a fairly closed scoping process under the DSM rules, that it's really largely up to the proponent to determine what their EIA looks like. There will certainly be standards that will enumerate a number of things, but it's not an open and consultative process. And it's not subject to oversight. When we looked across different EIA systems, that is certainly out of step with what we see as the appropriate practice. Most countries and in most EIA processes have a lot of oversight over the scoping, that the terms of reference are actually subject to consultation and are subject to some sort of agency approval, usually through the development of a scoping report, which is reviewed and to ensure that the proponent is going to go off and do a study that is actually going to meet the requirements. A particularly important element of this is the identification of alternatives. And this is important in this context because of the kind of nature of the normative environment. Because there's not a lot of existing standards, one of the ways in which we assess projects in environmental assessment is relativistically, by looking at different ways of doing the projects, different durations, different extents, and comparing those different alternatives. And so again, determining what those alternatives are, whether there's what's called a no action alternative, the alternative of just actually doing nothing, and being able to compare both the sort of environmental benefits, but also the other goals that we're trying to achieve through this process. In terms of consultation, and again, Angelique spoke a little bit to this, and so consultation is critically important throughout this process. So at the scoping stage, right now there is not, there is consultation, but it's largely at the end of the process when the EIA has been completed. And again, if we look at what other systems do, there's usually a much more iterative process with consultation at the scoping stage, at the draft EIA stage. And so proponents prepare a draft EIA, and it is subject to consultation so people can actually understand whether it's the right kind of study, and provide input to the study, and provide an opportunity for adjustments to the study if some things have been missed. There has been a little bit of experience with this with some of the testing sort of pilot mining EIAs, and when there was reporting back on those EIAs, there were, at least in one instance that I'm familiar with, a fair number of deficiencies that were acknowledged. I think the other part of this is is looking at the rules on confidentiality and ensuring that there's a high level of transparency in this process. And finally, let me turn to the sort of decision-making process itself. And again, one of the things we're particularly concerned with in terms of accountability is the degree of oversight and the form of oversight. And here we have to sort of recognize that there's concerns a little bit about a sort of black hole process, that an EIA is done, it goes into a decision-making process, and the result comes out the other end. But what we actually need is something much more transparent and much more responsive. Written reasons are standard in most EIA processes, and so the decision maker actually provides clear reasons as to the acceptance and acceptability of the environmental impact assessment. Clear rules around time frame, ensuring that there's enough time to review the EIA, that it's not a hurried process. And here again, if we look at the Antarctic, that process takes over a year, and that recognizes again the sort of complex decision-making environment in the international area. So I'll leave it at that because I'm over time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Much appreciated. Okay, so we're just a little hair off schedule, but not much. I think we're just fine. So we're very pleased and lucky and appreciative to have Dr. Mark Squillace on as well for our final presentation to set the stage for the discussions. Mark is the Raphael J. Moses Professor of Natural Resources Law at the University of Colorado Law School. He's a former Fulbright Scholar and the author or co-author of numerous articles and books on a wide range of natural resources law topics, including water resources, public lands, mining and minerals, and environmental policy. And while he's not maybe traditionally as familiar with the ISA community as our first two speakers, he definitely has jumped in and knows a lot about the work and is going to talk about comparisons between the ISA and the US mining regime. So Mark, thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to you to share your slides.
Thanks, Paul. Make sure I've got the right ones up here. Hopefully I do.
Yeah, the slide we're seeing looks like the right one.
Yeah.
Full screen slide. So we're seeing it the correct way. Best practices for DSM.
I'm going to go here just to make sure I've got. Okay, good. Okay.
All right.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Paul, so much. And thanks for the opportunity to talk with you today about some ideas that I've developed in terms of how we might think about deep seabed mining. I want to sort of begin, I guess, by just acknowledging that my career, as Paul suggested, has largely been focused on terrestrial mining issues. I've worked as a lawyer for the United States government, for a non-governmental organization, as an academic, and most recently I served on an expert panel tasked with developing standards for mine tailings disposal. But I have to say that deep seabed mining is a whole different animal in many respects, and I just want to acknowledge that when you're thinking about environmental impacts from something like terrestrial mining, we're looking at really different kinds of questions, I think, with deep seabed mining, and I've tried to keep that in mind as I think about how to approach some of the really compelling issues that we confront in trying to move forward with a deep seabed mining program. So my focus and my interest here is really on thinking about good mining regulation, beginning with a good decision-making process. And I think that it's possible to use some of the best procedures that we have in other programs that would help inform the kinds of things we can do with deep seabed mining. I'm particularly interested in the U.S. Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. I have a lot of experience with that statute, and Given the limited time, I'm not going to talk specifically about that law in the presentation, but I think it's fair to say that much of what I have to say is drawn from my experience with that law. Okay, so what makes for a good regulatory program? I focus on these 4 elements of a good regulatory program, and it starts with a strong agency. It's got to have the necessary technical expertise, the legal authority, and the independence from political influence to manage mining activities successfully. Of course, in order to do all of this, it has to have sufficient funding as well. It has to have comprehensive performance standards that explain how mining is going to take place and the limits and restrictions that would be imposed upon mining activities, presumably all with input from relevant stakeholders. It has to have, I skipped over the public-facing planning and permitting process, but I'm going to talk about that in the presentation as well. So really important that we think about how mining is going to take place before we engage in those mining activities. And then finally, there need to be inspection and enforcement protocols and strategies to ensure that the standards that we've developed are complied with. Note, as Angelique has already explained to us, it's really important that at every stage of the process, we have meaningful engagement with stakeholders, and I'll try to build that into my discussion as we go through this, this section. Okay, so let me touch on each of these 4 elements, beginning with sort of the agency and the structure of the agency and some issues associated with the agency. So most of you are aware of the ISA and how it is sort of organized. There's an assembly, of course, that includes all UNCLOS members with equal voting power. There's the council, which is 36 members elected by and from the assembly. And then there's the Legal and Technical Commission, the LTC, which is elected by the council. It's the LTC, I think, that is key here, because once it finds that the contract approval requirements are met, it has to recommend approval under the provisions of UNCLOS. And I think in some ways, more importantly, the council is effectively compelled to accept the recommendations on substantive decisions, because it can only overturn a substantive decision of the LTC with a supermajority of 2/3 of the council. And so that obviously makes the LTC a really important component of the decision-making process here. So in order, I think, to make these provisions work effectively, particularly these concerns about what is effectively automatic approval if certain standards are met, and also this supermajority requirement that only allows overturning a recommendation with a 2/3 vote of the council. I think that really these new rules that have just been proposed need to really focus on promoting transparency, the importance of a greater transparency in the system, and making sure that the standards that are included and required for a good contract are as comprehensive as we can possibly make them. They need to set minimum requirements, minimum procedures that all contractors must follow in order to first qualify for approval, and then we need to be sure that they will be meeting all of those requirements in their decision. So let me turn to the planning and contracting aspects of the decision making. So here again, I think some really important things that need to be taken into account in making decisions about letting a contract. Neil's already talked with us about the EIA process. I've referred to it as ESIA, including social impacts as well. But I think it's really important that that the contracts or the permits reflect that process, and that the standards that are adopted really assure that mining can be conducted in ways that address the problems that are likely to be encountered. And I have 5 different sort of elements that I think are really important to include in the planning and contracting process. First, I'd really like to see a small scale testing of the mining operations or the mining plans before we go through with actual mining, or at least full scale mining to take place. In this regard, I think it's important to recognize that the ISA and UNCLOS has set up an agency within the ISA, which is the enterprise, which is allowed essentially to engage in mining activities itself. I think the enterprise could be used in this context to actually do the small scale testing that I think is really important in deciding what kinds of standards or what kinds of restrictions you're going to impose on mining. The ISA and the enterprise have the advantage of being independent and not necessarily motivated by profit, but rather by understanding the kinds of impacts that are likely to occur with the particular mining methods that have been proposed by a contractor. And so I think this is an important element of a good plan, a good contract. A note, by the way, the enterprise has never been operationalized. I think there's a funding problem in terms of getting the enterprise up and going, but I think it's really important that the ISA think about how they can make the enterprise an important part in this process. There also, of course, need to be comprehensive reporting requirements. This would include reporting about mining activities, and I think about the significant unanticipated impacts that might occur during the mining process. I think Neil pointed out the problems of uncertainty that are going to face any mining operation in dealing with deep seabed mining, and certainly efforts to explain unexpected, unanticipated kinds of problems when they occur, maybe encounters with endangered species or unique wildlife, marine life, would be really important here. I think also that any good contract should include provisions requiring adaptive management. Now, Neil was talking toward the end of his presentation about the importance of what I guess I consider post-EIS or EIA kinds of processes. And I think here, what I usually think about is the adaptive management approach, which is essentially saying that we're going to learn from our experience. Learn by doing is sometimes the phrase that's used in conjunction with adaptive management. Essentially what this means, I think, in this context is that we've done our best through the EIA process to try to decide what kinds of restrictions and protocols we might put in place to protect the marine environment. But because of the uncertainty, we're not sure that we're going to get this exactly right. And so adaptive management basically tells us that we're going to essentially adapt the approach that we're taking to the mining operation to reflect the new information that we've gained from actually experiencing that process. I think it's a really key part of how the planning and the contracting should be carried out. Also, there should be a commitment to following the precautionary principle. I think this is very well accepted at the international level, and it just again reflects this problem of uncertainty. The more uncertainty that you have, the more caution you need to exercise, I think, in going forward with a particular decision. And I think here this is a good principle for us to follow in approving any kind of contract for mining. And finally, again, sort of building off of what Angelique has already talked to us about, there need to be really robust kinds of opportunities for public oversight and for public engagement. And here in this regard, I want to talk briefly about this idea of including in the contract review process, both informal and formal kinds of review procedures available to all stakeholders. One of the, I think, really interesting provisions of the Surface Mining Act from the United States is a provision that essentially allows what we call an informal conference. The idea here is that you get together informally with the decision maker before any final decisions are made, basically to sort of address the kinds of issues or problems that you feel haven't been adequately resolved. Sometimes this is just a way to overcome mistakes or misunderstandings, I think, that can occur. And so it's, I think, a really good process. It's less, I think, confrontational than a formal kind of protest might be. It hopefully is a way to resolve conflicts before they arise and do it in a way that is a little more congenial, I think, than more formal kinds of review. But I do think that formal review should be available for all interested stakeholders before the Seabed Disputes Chamber. It's not currently provided for, but I think it's really an important way in which the public can be effectively engaged in making sure that these contracts do what we all, I think, want them to do. Let me turn to performance standards that I think are an important part of any good mining plan or process. Here, I think what we're talking about is identifying and laying out the different kinds of mining techniques and methods that are going to be allowed. It's difficult, as we've talked about, because of the problems that we've already considered here. Again, I think the small scale testing protocols that I've talked about would be helpful in designing the kinds of performance standards that are going to be appropriate for any individual mining operation. And I think here we also want to use what are often described as SMART standards for measuring whether or not a party is complying with the standards that are laid out in the contract. SMART, of course, being the acronym for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound kinds of metrics. These provide a way for us to monitor and assure that the mining operation is actually meeting the requirements in the contract. And again, here, I think we want to engage stakeholders in making sure that these metrics are being met. And then finally, let me just briefly mention the inspection and enforcement program and the requirements for a good inspection and enforcement. I think there needs to be a regular inspection program to make sure that contractors are complying with all the terms of their contracts and of the performance standards that have been laid out. I think this would likely require rotating inspectors who live on board the vessels that are carrying out the mining operations. I mentioned that they should be rotating because I think it's important that no individual inspector get too close to the crew that's actually engaged in the mining operations. And so bringing different inspectors in over different periods of time, I think would help to avoid that kind of problem. I think there are other transparency kinds of things that could be built in to a good I&E program. So you could, for example, have live onboard cameras that are continuously showing what the mining activities are doing. I think these are the kinds of things that could evolve over time, because it may be difficult to know how best to do this. But again, I think engaging the public on how best to ensure that we know what's happening in the deep seabed, that would be a really useful kind of strategy or techniques. I think there need to be regular monitoring kinds of reports. I've put in here at least monthly, but there needs to be some assurance that we're seeing exactly what is happening out in the global commons and the deep seabed, and just trying to understand what kinds of activities are going on and whether or not the company is meeting the metrics that we've set for that particular operation. I also think, and this is again something that is adapted from the Surface Mining Act program, that stakeholders should be allowed to file complaints with the ISA, with the LTC, one of the sub-agencies within the ISA. The idea here being that if a stakeholder believes that there's a problem going on out at a site for whatever reason, if they have information that suggests that there are violations of the contract, there are violations of the performance standards that have been set out for that mining operation, that those problems can be fairly and quickly addressed by the agency to make sure that the contractor comes into compliance. I think this has been something that I think has worked reasonably well in the US federal system for mining. It's controversial, I suppose, in some respects, but really important, I think, for stakeholders to feel like they have a stake, a role to play in making sure that mining operations are conducted in the way that they're supposed to be conducted. And then finally, I think there needs to be clear whistleblower protections for employees. This is really, I think, particularly important because of the nature of the way mining is going to be conducted on the deep seabed. The employees are going to be more or less sequestered on these boats, probably for long periods of time. This is important that these employees feel like they are not going to be fired or discriminated against if they raise concerns or issues about the way that the mining operation is going. Indeed, to the extent possible, I think it's really important that we encourage employees to report on problems that are occurring. They're probably in the best position to know any problems that are occurring, and if there could be a protocol or program to ensure that these employees are encouraged to let us know about the problems that are occurring. That would be a really important addition to the program, and could be done hopefully in a way that that would be accepted by all parties. That's all I have for me for this morning, and I know later in the day for some of you. Thanks so much. I really look forward to having this discussion with the other panelists and of course with all of you.
Okay, Mark, thank you. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Angelique. We're gonna, if you can stop your screen share, Mark. We'll go back to maybe, and I'll ask Neil and Angelique to bring their cameras online. And I don't know if the view, I don't know if we can change that to gallery or how that works, but that might be nice. Anyway, so we've run a little over, but it was obviously great to hear from all three of you, your perspectives, and help set the stage. And I've got the benefit of seeing some of the questions that have already come in. And I know, I think we're going to want to get to some of those participant questions, but we do have these 4 questions on the agenda that we did want to spend a few minutes talking about, at least the next 10 or maybe 15 minutes on these. So maybe the first one goes to you, Angelique, and it really builds off of your original presentation, and then Neil and Mark's observations where they referred obviously to stakeholder engagement. But what considerations can be taken from the stakeholder engagement aspects of other models by the ISA community, I might add? So any thoughts on that, Angelique?
Thanks for that question, Paul. And I'm going to base it on my experience of another multilateral process that essentially concerns the global commons, right? So the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I think there's a lot to learn there. I in no way am I suggesting that the UNFCCC process is perfect, but I think it provides a good comparator. So first off, just to say, there have been steps to ensure that there is official representation of various stakeholders, and here I'm thinking about young goals, having an official youth constituency within the process. And I saw a question come in with regards to, a bit questioning whose responsibility is it to get young people involved in the process. And I think, in short, the answer is it's everyone's responsibility. And I completely agree with the suggestion that, of course, states should include young people in their delegation. And that's really, where it started many years ago within the UNFCCC process, with that conversation of inclusion within official delegations. But there also needs to be a recognized platform for meaningful participation and engagement, rather than something tokenistic or, trying to fill a statistic. And it's been quite interesting. In fact, just yesterday, I was on another webinar with regards to the BBNJ, and there we have young people from around the world connecting to create a youth network around BBNJ. So again, I think it should be a concerted effort by young people, by states, but also by the International Seabed Authority to take these steps to have this type of official representation. Just to note, the UNFCCC has a gender action plan, for example, looking at mainstreaming of gender within the various processes and meetings and negotiations. They also have a platform for Indigenous peoples, and there has been a lot of already literature seeking the incorporation of traditional knowledge and science to have the best decision making. So there again, I think something to learn from the UNFCCC. And maybe just to note, I believe there was a communications and stakeholder engagement strategy that was recently circulated, or recently, a couple of months ago, circulated by the ISA. And the definition there of stakeholder could be wider, and be more provide more an aspirational strategy to reach out to humankind, rather than simply stating sort of state of play. So I think that there was a missed opportunity, but definitely a great avenue to address the challenge, the weaknesses, I would say, that could be well improved and ensure that we have more stakeholders engaged in the process.
Great, thanks, Angelique. Neil or Mark, any other thoughts about this question around kind of lessons or applications from other models as it relates to stakeholder engagement in the ISA? Yeah, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's really great, Angelique, what you're doing to try to promote engagement with young people in particular and all folks who are interested in this topic. I know it's a really difficult problem. And I guess what I just highlight here is the exceptional difficulty associated with doing this in the deep seabed, where we don't really have access. I mean, how can the public really engage in a meaningful way with what's going on out there? And that's why I think transparency is so important here, just trying as best we can to let the public in on what's going on in the deep seabed through reports, through cameras, other kinds of tools that we have to try to make this feel a little more open to the public and engagement. I mentioned the idea for an informal conference, a way I think you can really meaningfully engage. You don't need to be a lawyer to sort of talk with the decision maker about concerns or problems that you have, and you can hopefully engage with them in a meaningful way to correct mistakes, frankly, or at least to make sure that concerns that might not have been considered would be adequately considered. So I think these transparency issues are critically important when you're dealing with something like deep seabed mining and the difficulty, I think, of knowing what's actually happening out there.
Right. Neil, I think you wanted to add something as well.
Yeah, just really quickly, and it's on a slightly different point, but one of the things we see in EIA processes is a lot of interagency consultation. And when we think about this in the context of deep seabed mining, we have a very sort of fragmented governance structure within the oceans. And one thing that enough attention hasn't been paid to is getting the views of other international oceans regulators, because there's a lot of aggregated interests. And so RFMOs, regional seas commissions, the interaction between what's going to come out of the BBNJ and the DSM. And right now, I think there's a risk that we're going to have a very unintegrated approach to marine planning in the deep oceans unless we start thinking about processes where international agencies can engage one another across these boundaries. And the other point I would point out apropos to what Angelique and Mark were saying is increasingly we're seeing human rights approaches being applied to EIA. There's a number of international decisions around the international right to an EIA. And I think we have to think more carefully about the application of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People in ocean spaces. And the whole idea of human rights in ocean spaces, which is a really underdeveloped area, but I think is going to be something that people will be paying attention to.
Okay, thanks. Hey, I'm seeing some of the questions, and I'm going to do a little audible here, and rather than go on to the next question, I want to just identify a couple of things that participants are saying on this stakeholder engagement, transparency specifically, if that's okay. So one of the thoughts I had was that, or one of the questions that was raised, I should say, and you, Angelique, may have already spoken to this, so if it's not essential to add more, don't feel like you need to, but somebody's, noted and concurred that during this COVID process, there have been these silent procedures for some of the issues, but was wondering kind of during a non-COVID year, or in the past and moving forward, were there particular hindrances that prevent those communities, that broader cross-section from participating? And I might add, are there specific ways to enhance or encourage their participation, again, coming out of this COVID situation, looking forward? And that would go to all three of you. So specific hindrances and then specific ways to encourage or enhance that at the ISA.
Maybe, I mean, I indeed, Paul, I have, I have spoken to the points of, you know, the various hindrances that do exist, you know, varying from even awareness about what the ISA is doing, even understanding the avenues and pathways to engage, and the fact that, you know, it's state, non-state actors that so far haven't been as active as they could be. So I think in terms of one of the ways that we can address this, again, I'd say, you know, a great communications and education strategy that really reaches out to the public, to humankind. And that should not, it should be a strategy, you know, accompanied with like a clear roadmap and plan to make it happen. And as I've mentioned in my interventions, moving from sort of like these great aspirational language to concrete action is going to be necessary if we're going to realize that participation and engagement.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my comment would be that we may get really bogged down in project level assessment, and project level assessment tends to be quite technical. The reports are very technical. It's very hard to engage people. And a lot of what people are interested in deep seabed mining are some of this sort of larger sort of threshold issues around deep seabed mining. I think a more robust process of strategic environmental assessment and strategic planning that engages the public to come at some of these larger ideas and actually have those translated into usable documents. So the rent process, I think, was an interesting and useful process. I'm not that familiar with how consultative the rent process was. I know that there was a lot of back and forth, but I think, you know, the ISA is going to have to sort of continue to sort of build out these processes. I don't think it can rely entirely on project level assessment, because I just think project level assessment often doesn't get at some of the really big important issues that people and states care about.
Yeah, so I come at this from sort of the perspective of an educator. That's my main job, is as a teacher, and thinking about this a little more long term. Just that we as a society, I think this is true in most countries, don't do a very good job of teaching civic engagement and how to do it, and actually encouraging our students to do it. And so one way to be thinking about this perhaps is starting from the earliest stages of education, getting kids involved in understanding some of these big global issues that are occurring, sort of thinking about this as the way Neil was talking about it, as being sort of the big picture kinds of issues. All of us sort of have some reaction to concerns about the way that mining might take place. So we don't really maybe know fully, it's hard to understand the technical issues perhaps, but if we get people involved early on and get them interested in being engaged, I think that can help overcome some of the problems that these folks will have later in life. If you've done it once, this is my experience because I teach, one of the classes that I teach, it has students required to file a public comment on a pending project. And what I find is that even for law students, they come at it, they don't really know how to start. And by the end of the process, they're typically very much engaged in the task that's at hand. And I think we can start a lot earlier with our students and young people and get them involved. And I think that'll take time to do, but over time, I would like to think that we're really going to improve the way in which younger people are engaged in these very important issues.
Okay, yeah, great suggestion, Mark. I was wondering some of that kind of thinking about that as well. Hey, there's another question in this space. It's a little different, but that I thought maybe could come up, and then we'll turn to the second of the predetermined questions that are on the agenda. But basically, you know, the participant said that the ISA has done a great job of encouraging and supporting observers participating in the ISA, in particular in the meetings, the annual meetings. However, contractors don't have that same status as observers during those formal meetings, given their key roles as a stakeholder, is that an oversight that should be reconsidered? Any thoughts on that particular thread?
My observation from going to the meeting is the contractors are have access to the processes. They have experts, and I don't think that they're disadvantaged in any particular way vis-a-vis other observers. They're sophisticated actors for the most part, and they're well resourced. And I certainly think that contractors deserve the same sort of fairness, but they have rights that observers don't have, and including rights to appeal decisions of the council if they don't get a license issued, and observers or other stakeholders certainly don't have those rights. And so I think there's a balance, but I think it's a fairly reasonably struck balance.
Okay, great. Thanks, Neil. Okay, let's move on. And again, some of these questions coming in from the participants in a fantastic way are ones I think you all will enjoy speaking to. So I don't want to spend too much time on these prior ones, but let me just flag, the second one was, what do you consider to be the essential elements of an effective environmental decision-making framework, and why? There's a question that came up in the Q&A that said, Neil and Mark, you've already made good suggestions, but the person's not, feels like the ISA maybe hasn't heard those kinds of suggestions before. How much progress do you feel like, and maybe this is somewhat linked to the standards and guidelines, which recently just obviously came out last week, as Andrew said, and as most of you already know. But how much do you think the ISA's made in putting in place some of the ideas that you're suggesting be considered? If you've looked at the EIAs that have already been completed, for test mining, did they incorporate some of the types of suggestions? So it's kind of a pretty broad area of discussion, but any thoughts from you? Maybe I'll turn to Neil first.
Yeah, I mean, I think my main talk, covered a lot of these, and so maybe I'll just speak to one issue and then get to some of the specifics about whether the ISA is listening. And it's really a point that Mark made around adaptive management, and I think this is again a sort of critically important area, and it ties into sort of what we've seen with some of the EIAs that have already been done. And we're working in a very imperfect knowledge environment. And I think if we work from the assumption that sort of ex ante decision making, beforehand decision making is going to be even imperfectly predictive, is just an overly optimistic assumption. I think we have to assume that we're going to find out things once mining begins that we don't know now, and we have to create a system that is adaptive. That is particularly challenging in this environment because of the structure of the leases, but I think that it's critically important, and I think it's a trend that we're seeing, and quite frankly, I think it's probably part of the ISA and the sponsoring states' due diligence obligations to ensure that they're responsive. And the changes won't just be to our scientific understanding. I think the changes will also be to our kind of normative understanding, that standards that we set now may change as we find out more, that we find out that buffer areas or sedimentation zones are inadequate or maybe overly adequate. And so it could cut both ways. Is the ISA list? I mean, I have no idea whether the, these are processes, and people make comments and make suggestions, and decisions get get made. It's a multilateral process. Multilateral processes are very complex. There's a lot of things involved in multilateral complex decision-making in environments. I don't think we've really, I don't think we really know, because the draft exploitation regs are, haven't been considered by council yet. So we'll see. I would say where it appears, that some groups seem to be more responsive than others, in the sense that I think I've seen the Africa group make some quite strong recommendations in terms of what they see. And so I think we'll see some sort of more regional and country-based approaches. But I think we just have to recognize it is a multilateral process. It is led by states, and states are going to lead it. And there is space for observers, but it's a state-based process.
Okay, Mark, did you have anything you want to add?
I do, but Angelique had her hand up, so I'll.
Okay, I didn't. Yeah, go ahead, Angelique.
Just a very short point on, is the ISA listening? So I've had firsthand experience, and of course this cannot be generalized. This was one issue that the African group brought forward with regards to capacity building. And the issue was, we made a submission, and the issue was reacted upon, and there was a workshop to look at ensuring that capacity building is as required for developing countries and is meaningful and can be used later on, rather than, things that we sort of enjoy for a very short period of time, but we don't have this lasting capacity built in-house, mostly because we don't have access to these technologies and other trainings and infrastructure. So I think I wouldn't say no. I think there are instances where ISA is listening, and they are reacting to submissions made by different groups. And as Neil pointed out, it is a state-driven process, and perhaps it is the case that because this came from a bloc, it was very persuasive for the ISA to react upon.
Right.
Let me just add to what Neil and Angelique were saying here, and just say that I'm a big fan of EIA. I think it's a terrific process, but if there is a flaw, and it's not unique to the deep seabed mining context, but if there's a flaw in EIA, it is a pre-decisional tool only, as it's usually exercised. And I think Neil was trying to point out that we can't view it that way, that we need to think beyond the decision. And that's part of what I was trying to suggest with an adaptive management protocol. I want to think about EIA as being this kind of living process, a living document that we're constantly revising and improving to reflect the new information that we're getting. And that could not be more important when you're dealing in this low information environment that we have with respect to deep seabed mining. So that's, I guess, my take on this. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Hey, Neil in particular, but obviously anybody else, I mean, you had mentioned that a no action option and alternative operations are usually assessed as part of EIAs, but the attendee indicated that's not required in the draft regulations. Maybe you said that as well, but can you or either of the other panelists say more about how that might work in the ISA context? Is it something that can be aligned with the ISA's mandate, focused on seabed mining, and does the need to achieve overall benefit for humankind help to bring in assessment of alternatives?
Yeah, and so this goes back to my point a little bit around strategic environmental assessment. I'm not sure that doing a no action alternative at the project level is going to be particularly effective or useful. There is a debate on the overall need for deep seabed mining, and it's a kind of supply issue, but it's also an environmental issue that in terms of the relative environmental impacts of terrestrial mining versus seabed mining. There are a set of issues about how much mining and what are the alternatives to deep seabed mining. I think those are best done at a strategic level. I think that it enables a more fulsome discussion from states where there's not, either because a state is a contractor itself or because a state is a terrestrial mining producer, have a highly personal stake in the matter. And so again, I think what I would like to see evolve over time is a more strategic approach to deep seabed mining. How much is necessary? How much do we need? It's going to have to very much stay in line with what we understand about the environment, and it's going to evolve. And so I wouldn't, I'm not sure I would push for a no action alternative at the project level, but I would certainly push for more fulsome strategic level decisions that address some of these issues about what the alternatives are, not the alternative ways of doing the project, but alternatives to the project.
Okay, great. Not seeing a hand from the other two. I'll leave that one there. We don't have a lot more time. I wanted to, there's a couple of questions related to kind of, just like we talked about from the beginning, application from other regimes. So one of the things, and I think a couple of you might've mentioned this in your presentations, there's been a lot of work to better understand what's happening in the deep sea and the potential impacts of deep seabed mining, but there's still a lot, I think everyone can agree, that we don't know. Are there examples of effective environmental decision-making, regulatory development in knowledge-poor environments or knowledge-limited maybe? And if so, how did those work? Any thoughts on how you might move forward? And Mark, you obviously mentioned directly in your slides the precautionary principle and the small-scale test. And those have challenges in this scenario, this situation. But any thoughts from you about other examples of how that's worked?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I can give you specific examples, and I'm a little wary of trying to differentiate among the different countries that might be thinking about promoting mining activities. I guess what I would say, and this is something I didn't have a chance to cover in my opening remarks, is just concerns that I have about the way that state-sponsored projects are going to be handled generally, regardless of who's doing it. The way that I read the convention, essentially, if a state wants to sponsor a project, the ISA is involved at the front end of those activities, making sure that things are being done according to the regulations, but then it is essentially turned over to the state that is sponsoring the project to basically take care of ensuring compliance. And indeed, the convention seems to say that as long as the state has an adequate program, administrative process, and technical standards, that they can't be held responsible for violations of that contract. That strikes me as a highly problematic kind of thing. And there doesn't appear to be any particular way for the ISA to engage the state-sponsored states that is sponsoring the activity in an effective way, that is through enforcement or those kinds of things. So that's something to look at carefully. I'm hoping that there might be some room within the language of the convention that the ISA could adopt regulations to make sure that if there is non-compliance, that non-compliance is appropriately addressed, regardless of whether or not the state has an adequate administrative system. I mean, we all know of systems around the world where there might be an adequate law. If you just read the paper statute, there might even be an adequate agency tasked with implementing it, but then it doesn't actually work out in the way that we expect. And so I think that's a big concern with the way that the convention currently reads. And again, I'm hoping that the ISA can find a way to make sure that if there are violations of contracts or standards that are set out in the rules, that those are addressed and addressed appropriately and promptly.
Okay. Any other? So we're kind of getting, unfortunately, there's quite a few other questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of those today, unfortunately. To close, maybe maybe start with Angelique, or if she defers, that's fine too. But we had a question in the agenda that was just kind of, what are your top 1 or 2 key takeaways that might be applicable to governance of mining on the deep seabed, based on obviously these presentations and the discussion the 3 of you have had. And I'll start with Angelique if you want, but again, if you want to defer for a little bit, that's fine too. Go ahead.
Thanks, Paul. I mean, for me, it's going to be, you're going to have stakeholder engagement. People who are going to be impacted by the decisions that we're making in these rooms have to be part of the discussions. That's definitely my first takeaway message. And the second one is also to understand the different stakeholders. Coming from a small island developing state, a coastal nation, there are varying capacities with stakeholders. We're speaking about very elaborate contracts and so much information, so much data that we're already saying that we don't know as much as we should. I think that we need to appreciate the differences within stakeholders. As you can imagine, a coastal state is like the Seychelles, for example, is looking to address the issues within its own exclusive economic zone, and now to think of this next level of activities in the area and how there's interplay and connectivity between those 2 areas as well. So just to say that we need to be very conscious of all the stakeholders involved. I think that's my take-home message.
Great, thanks. And I mean, as you noted, and I think others did too, there's been progress in some of those areas and responsiveness. And there's also things that, like Mark was saying, kind of from an education perspective and helping folks. So, but good thoughts. Neil, any kind of your top 1 or 2 key takeaways you'd like to leave the group with at this point?
Yeah, I guess I'd make 2 points, and the first one is really about how we think about these processes, and I think we have to recognize that these processes are more than technical processes. That we have to treat them as political processes, and we have to treat them as normative processes. And I think we have to understand that this is an area that is deeply contested and will be deeply contested for the foreseeable future. And that really means that if it's going to be a successful regime, however you define success, it means that we really have to think about processes that engage people and try to build on our shared understandings of what we think the deep ocean should be used for. I think well-designed regulatory processes can be transformative in the sense that they can make people with entrenched interests rethink their interests in light of new information, in light of new normative ideas. And I think if we're going to see success here, then these processes that Angelique and Mark and I have talked about really, a critical emphasis on transparency, a critical emphasis on hearing all different voices in a sort of respectful way, and that includes the voices of contractors and sponsoring states. And I guess the other point is more of an institutional one. I did see a question in the chat around the role of the LTC, and I think maybe right now that the LTC is a little bit problematic in the sense that I think it was set up as a largely technical body, technical bodies, sort of highly expert driven and to some degree closed, but it's clearly not operating as such. It's making critical decisions that are of political importance, that are, and so there's a lot of criticism of the LTC and its closed processes, but it's just playing a different function than it was designed for. And so there may be some need for some institutional rethinking, which is really difficult to think about because it may involve, I don't think we can open up the convention. And so thinking about institutional restructuring within a fairly confined space of the convention will also be a challenge, but I think maybe a necessary challenge. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously, I mean, maybe goes without saying as well, but I mean, the LTC plays a huge role in lots of the forward progress and has been doing their technical work very well in many instances. But that reassessment, given kind of changing, seems like a useful thing to think about. Okay, Mark, last
quickly, I know we're low on time, and great points about the LTC, Neil. I appreciate that. Two things I'll mention quickly. One is, I think we need to emphasize going slow here. You know, there is no need to rush into deep seabed mining. We don't know, as Neil has pointed out, we don't know enough to really do this in a way that could really cause some significant harm to the marine environment. So let's go slow. Let's try to figure out what the consequences are and then behave accordingly. And then a related point is that we need to plan for the unexpected. We know where we don't actually know what the consequences of these actions are going to be. And so we need to write the contracts and we need to write the rules in a way that anticipate the problems. The concept of adaptive management that Neil and I have talked about is a way, if it's included in contracts, if it's required in the rules, this can be a way that we can essentially fix problems that we hadn't anticipated when the contracts were led or when the rules were written, because we're constantly learning from the experience that we gain. And so those are, I guess, my two takeaways from the discussion. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you. We could easily go on for another half an hour. Those of you that are familiar with the Pew and RESOLVE model of meeting in Jamaica, where we're sitting in a room together, really does allow for obviously a lot more interactive discussion with everybody, but really appreciate Angelique, Neil, and Mark's participation. Hopefully it was helpful to folks, and maybe it's good to leave you wanting more, but that's where we are in terms of the schedule. So later today, you'll be receiving a survey from Resolve, as well as a participant list, I believe, and the slides or a link to the slides on our website. Then, as I already mentioned, we'll be posting a recording and then a summary later at some point in the near future. So let me just turn to Andrew with any last closing comments. Andrew, anything you'd like to say?
Just one more word of thanks to all of you for joining us today, for your time, for the robust discussion, and to all of our panelists for their insights. Hopefully, we won't have too many more of these virtual sessions ahead, but in the meantime, we'll be doing everything we can to keep this exchange ongoing, open, and engaging. So thanks again to everybody.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. Have a nice day. Sorry we went a couple minutes over, but we'll see you on the next time around. Take care, everybody.